The body arrived at the Harlan County Medical Examiner's office on a cold Tuesday morning in March of 2014. It came sealed inside a black bag, tagged with paperwork that looked routine, the kind of paperwork that passed through the office almost every day. The official report from the hospital listed the cause of death as a probable cardiac event. A woman in her early 50s had been found unresponsive in her bed by her husband. Paramedics had arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The attending physician had signed off on hypertensive heart disease. It was a sad but ordinary ending. Deaths like that rarely raised questions. In most cases, the body would be examined quickly, the paperwork finalized, and the file closed within a matter of hours. Families would grieve, funerals would be held, and life would continue. There was nothing unusual about this one, at least not at first glance. The woman's name was Claire Alderton. She was 51 years old. According to the hospital records, she had a history of stress-related health complaints. Fatigue, digestive problems, headaches. Nothing severe enough to suggest something sinister. Just the sort of vague symptoms that many people experience as they move through middle age. The report suggested her heart had finally given out. Her husband, Douglas Alderton, had already begun receiving visitors by the time the body was transported to the examiner's office. Friends from the community were bringing food and offering condolences. The local newspaper had already drafted a short obituary describing Claire as a beloved teacher who had dedicated her life to education. There were flowers arriving at the house, sympathy cards, the quiet rituals that follow a natural death in a small town. Everything seemed to be unfolding exactly the way it always did. Except for one thing. The deputy medical examiner assigned to the case was a woman named Dr. Renata Voss, and she had a habit that had made her both respected and unpopular in her profession. She paid attention to details that most people ignored. Renata had spent nearly 2 decades working in forensic pathology. She had performed thousands of autopsies. She had testified in dozens of homicide trials. Over the years, she had learned something that many people outside her field did not understand. Death rarely hides its secrets completely. Even when someone tries very hard to disguise the truth, the human body tends to leave behind small traces of what really happened. Most of the time, those traces are subtle, easy to overlook if someone is in a hurry. But Renata was not someone who rushed through her work. When she opened Claire Alderton's file and reviewed the preliminary report, something felt off. Not dramatically wrong. Not enough to raise immediate alarms. Just a faint sense of dissonance between the paperwork and the quiet intuition that years of experience had built inside her. It was the sort of feeling she had learned not to ignore. She began the examination the way she always did, carefully and methodically. At first, everything appeared consistent with the report. There were no obvious injuries, no signs of trauma, no indication that Claire had struggled before her death. Her body showed none of the bruises or wounds that often accompany violent crime. But then Renata noticed something unusual. It was subtle enough that many examiners might have missed it entirely. Claire's skin carried a faint grayish tone that didn't quite match the expected signs of heart failure. It wasn't dramatic. Not the kind of discoloration that would immediately scream foul play. But it lingered there in the background of the examination, quietly refusing to match the story the paperwork was telling. Renata continued her work. When she examined the gastrointestinal tract, she saw something else that didn't sit right. The lining of the stomach showed signs of irritation. Not the acute inflammation that might occur during a sudden illness, but a pattern suggesting something had been irritating the stomach repeatedly over time. Chronic exposure to something. Still, that alone wasn't enough to prove anything. Then she looked at Claire's hands. The fingernails appeared mostly normal at first glance, but under closer inspection Renata saw thin pale bands stretching horizontally across them. They were faint, easy to dismiss if someone wasn't specifically looking for them, but Renata had seen them before. They were called Mies lines, and in rare cases, they were associated with exposure to arsenic. At that moment, the quiet feeling she'd had earlier grew stronger. It still wasn't proof. There were other explanations. But together, The subtle skin discoloration, the irritated stomach lining, and the nail patterns formed a constellation of signs that Renata couldn't ignore. If she was wrong, the extra testing would simply confirm the natural death that had already been reported. But if she was right, something far more disturbing might be hiding beneath the surface. So she ordered a full toxicology panel, including tests for heavy metals. It wasn't a standard procedure for cases believed to be natural deaths. Many examiners would have skipped it entirely. Toxicology tests take time and money, and most of the time they confirm exactly what the initial diagnosis suggested. But Renata wasn't comfortable closing the file yet. After placing the order, she sealed the samples and sent them to the lab. Then she waited. 9 days later, the results arrived in her inbox. Renata was sitting alone at her desk when she opened the report. At first she read it slowly, carefully reviewing each line. Then she read it again. The laboratory findings confirmed what her instincts had warned her about. Claire Alderton's blood and tissue samples contained elevated levels of arsenic. Not the kind of levels that suggested a single catastrophic poisoning. Those cases looked very different. Instead, the pattern in Claire's body pointed to something far more calculated. The arsenic concentrations suggested repeated exposure over a long period of time. Weeks, months, possibly years. Renata leaned back in her chair, staring at the report. The toxicology results alone were alarming, but the hair analysis told an even more detailed story. Human hair grows slowly, and certain substances leave traces along the strands as they move through the body. By analyzing those strands in segments, forensic scientists can sometimes reconstruct a timeline of exposure. In Claire's case, the timeline revealed intermittent spikes in arsenic levels stretching back more than a year. Someone had been feeding her small amounts of poison repeatedly. The doses had been carefully spaced, small enough to avoid immediate death but large enough to slowly weaken her body. Then, roughly 12 to 18 hours before her death, a much larger amount had entered her system. The final dose. Claire Alderton had not died of heart disease. She had been murdered. Renata closed the report and sat in silence for a moment. Cases like this were rare, but they were not unheard of. Throughout history, arsenic had earned a reputation as one of the most insidious poisons imaginable. It had no strong taste or smell when mixed into food or drink. Its symptoms could easily mimic natural illness. And when administered in small amounts over time, it could slowly destroy a person's health without drawing immediate suspicion. The method required patience, planning, and access to the victim's daily life. Renata knew exactly what she needed to do next. She picked up the phone and contacted the Kentucky State Police. The investigation that followed would stretch over the next several years, gradually unraveling a story that no one in the town of Millfield had ever imagined. Because the man who had been living beside Claire Alderton for more than 2 decades was not the man everyone believed him to be. Millfield, Kentucky was the kind of place where nothing much seemed to change. Tucked deep within the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky's coal country, the town moved at a slower pace than the cities. The population hovered around 4,000 people, and most families had lived there for generations. The diner on Main Street still served the same recipes it had used in the 1980s. The local hardware store was owned by the same family that had opened it decades earlier. Friday nights in the fall revolved around high school football games. People waved when they passed each other on the street. In communities like that, trust was part of the culture. And certain people held positions that carried enormous respect. One of those people was the principal of the town's only high school. Douglas Alderton had held that position since 1991. When he first arrived in Millfield, he was only 28 years old. Fresh out of graduate school, ambitious, confident, and eager to build a career in education. Over the years, he had established himself as a cornerstone of the community. He coached junior varsity baseball during his early years. He organized scholarship funds for students who wanted to attend college. He attended community events and charity drives. People described him as dependable, responsible, a man who cared about the future of the town's children. When students graduated and returned years later, Douglas often remembered their names. He asked about their families, their careers, small gestures that left lasting impressions. To most people in Millfield, Douglas Alderton represented stability. He was exactly the kind of person no one would ever suspect of something monstrous. Claire had arrived in Millfield 2 years before Douglas. She was different from most people in town. She had grown up in Louisville, the daughter of a jazz musician and a public defender. Her upbringing had exposed her to a wider world of music, literature, and ideas that didn't always fit neatly into the rhythms of a small Appalachian town. But Claire embraced Millfield with enthusiasm. She joined the faculty at the local high school as an English teacher and quickly became one of the most beloved educators in the district. She encouraged her students to read widely and think deeply. She introduced them to authors they had never encountered before. She ran a creative writing club that met on Friday afternoons, inviting students to explore storytelling and poetry. Many former students would later say that Claire was the teacher who made them believe their voices mattered. When she married Douglas in 1992, the union seemed natural. Two educators, two respected members of the school community. They bought a modest white house on Canary Creek Road and settled into the quiet routines of married life. From the outside, their relationship looked perfectly normal. But years later, when investigators began asking questions, several people remembered small moments that suddenly felt different in hindsight. One colleague recalled that Claire seemed to grow quieter whenever Douglas entered a room. Another remembered that Claire often appeared tired and withdrawn during faculty meetings. At the time, these things seemed insignificant. People assumed she was simply stressed from work, or that she and Douglas had the same minor disagreements every couple experiences. But behind the closed doors of their home, a darker reality had been slowly unfolding. Claire had been getting sick for years. The symptoms came and went in unpredictable waves. Sometimes she experienced intense stomach pain. Other times she suffered from crushing fatigue that left her struggling to get through the day. There were headaches, dizziness, and periods of weakness that sent her to the doctor multiple times. Each time, the medical explanations seemed reasonable. Just viral infections, digestive disorders. None of the doctors treating her suspected poisoning. And so the pattern continued, month after month, year after year. The person responsible remained patient, careful, quiet, waiting. The person responsible for Claire's illness had understood something very important about poison. A fast poison creates panic. It creates obvious symptoms, sudden collapse, emergency responses. Doctors search for answers when someone healthy suddenly dies. But a slow poison does something very different. It becomes invisible. When the body weakens gradually, when symptoms appear in waves and then fade, people rarely assume something sinister is happening. They look for ordinary explanations. Just diet. The kinds of things that doctors see every day. And for years, that is exactly what happened. Claire's doctors treated each new symptom as an isolated problem. A stomach infection, exhaustion, a possible food intolerance. None of those diagnoses were unreasonable. In fact, they were exactly the kinds of explanations most physicians would reach when faced with the vague, inconsistent symptoms that chronic arsenic exposure can produce. Each time Claire seemed to recover, the concern faded, and the person poisoning her continued. By the time Dr. Renata Voss called the Kentucky State Police, Claire had already been buried. The quiet town of Millfield had returned to its normal rhythm. Classes continued at the high school. The diner on Main Street served its usual morning crowd. People spoke softly about Claire's passing and how sudden it had been. Most of them believed it was simply a tragic natural death. That belief would soon begin to unravel. The call from Dr. Voss landed on the desk of Detective Leon Marsh. Marsh had spent most of his career investigating financial crimes. Fraud, embezzlement, insurance scams. Cases that required patience rather than dramatic action. By the time Claire Alderton's case reached him, he was in his early 50s and only a couple of years away from retirement. At first, the case didn't seem like the kind of investigation that would land on his desk. But something about the medical examiner's report caught his attention. Arsenic. Not a sudden poisoning. A slow one. That meant the suspect pool was already extremely small. Because slow poisoning almost always requires access. Access to food. Access to daily routines. access to the victim's private life. Marsh drove to Millfield the next morning. He parked outside the local diner and sat inside for a while, quietly observing the town around him. Investigators often do this when they arrive in a new community. They watch the way people interact. They listen to the tone of conversations. They try to understand the place before they begin asking difficult questions. Millfield looked peaceful. People greeted each other warmly. A waitress moved between tables with a coffee pot. Nothing about the scene suggested that a murder investigation was about to begin. Eventually, Marsh approached the counter and asked the woman working there if she had known Claire Alderton. The woman nodded immediately. Everyone in town knew Claire. She was one of the good ones, the waitress said, pouring him a cup of coffee. Always kind to everybody. Marsh asked about Douglas. The waitress shrugged. He's been in here a couple times since she passed, she said. Seems to be holding up all right. That comment stuck with Marsh. Grief looks different for everyone, of course. There is no single way a person is supposed to behave after losing a spouse. But experienced investigators learn to notice emotional patterns. Sometimes what matters most isn't what people say. It's what they don't. Over the next several weeks, Marsh and his partner began building the investigation carefully. Cases like this cannot rely on speculation. They require evidence, and evidence takes time to gather. The forensic work continued first. Claire's medical history was examined in detail. Doctors' visits, prescriptions, hospital records. Every documented illness from the previous decade was mapped onto the timeline created by the hair analysis. What investigators discovered was chilling. Every time Claire had been hospitalized for severe stomach illness, arsenic levels in her hair showed a spike. Every time she seemed to recover, the levels dropped again. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been adjusting the poison dosage over time, increasing it, reducing it, carefully managing the exposure. Whoever was responsible understood exactly what they were doing. At the same time, detectives began investigating Claire's personal life. They looked at friendships, family relationships, and co-workers. Anyone who might have had a motive. But the deeper they looked, the more one fact became obvious. Claire was widely loved. She had no enemies. Her colleagues described her as generous and thoughtful. Former students remembered her years after graduation. She had a reputation for helping struggling teenagers long after school hours had ended. There were no angry ex-partners, no financial disputes, no obvious reason anyone outside her household would want to harm her. That realization shifted the investigation in a very specific direction. Because if the motive didn't exist outside the home, then it might exist inside it. Detectives began examining Douglas Alderton's life more closely. At first, nothing stood out. His employment record was spotless. His finances appeared stable. His reputation in town was overwhelmingly positive. But modern investigations often uncover details that traditional interviews cannot. Digital records, financial transactions, communication histories. And slowly, those details began to reveal cracks in the image Douglas had spent decades building. The first discovery came from his bank records. There were several transactions that didn't match the routine spending patterns of a small-town school principal. Hotel bookings in nearby cities. Restaurant charges that appeared during weekends when Douglas had supposedly been working late. Individually, none of these transactions proved anything. But taken together, they suggested something that investigators see often in homicide cases involving spouses: an affair. Eventually, detectives identified the person Douglas had been meeting. Her name was Patricia Holden. She lived in Lexington, about 2 hours away from Millfield. When investigators contacted her, Patricia was shocked to hear from them. She knew Douglas as a man who was unhappy in his marriage but trying to do the right thing. He had told her repeatedly that his relationship with Claire was essentially over. According to Douglas, they were simply waiting for the right time to separate. Patricia believed him. The messages between them painted a picture of a relationship that had grown increasingly serious over time. They discussed travel plans, future homes, even the possibility of living together once Douglas was free. But there was one message that caught investigators' attention more than any other. It had been sent just days before Claire's death. "I think we're nearly there," Douglas had written. The wording was vague, but when detectives read it in the context of the toxicology reports, it took on a much darker meaning. Still, the investigation needed something stronger than suspicion. They needed to know where the arsenic had come from, because arsenic is not easy to obtain. Modern regulations make it difficult for ordinary people to purchase or store it legally. Somewhere, somehow, Douglas would have had to access it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected phone call. A retired chemistry teacher named Earl Whitman had read a small article in the local newspaper mentioning the investigation into Claire's death. Something about it triggered a memory. Whitman had taught at Millfield High School for nearly 30 years before retiring. During that time, the school's chemistry department maintained a locked storage room containing old laboratory chemicals that had been purchased decades earlier. Among those chemicals were 2 sealed containers of arsenic trioxide. The compounds had originally been used for classroom demonstrations long before modern safety regulations tightened. Eventually, the school stopped using them, but the chemicals were never properly disposed of. They simply sat on a shelf in the locked storage room, forgotten. When investigators arrived at the school and examined the inventory, they discovered something alarming. One of the containers was missing. Only 2 people had access to the storage room key: the chemistry teacher and the principal, Douglas Alderton. A forensic team searched the Alderton home once more. This time they focused on microscopic traces. In the kitchen, inside a cabinet where Claire kept her daily vitamins and supplements, they found it. Tiny particles of arsenic trioxide. The poison had been hidden in something Claire consumed every morning. A powdered herbal supplement recommended by her doctor for fatigue. It had been the perfect delivery system. Small doses. Invisible. Administered day after day. For years. The investigation that followed moved quickly. Douglas Alderton was arrested in November of 2015 as he pulled into his driveway after work. The news spread through Millfield faster than anyone expected. Many residents refused to believe it. For decades, Douglas had been a trusted figure in the community. Parents had entrusted him with their children's education. Students had looked up to him as a mentor. The idea that he could have spent years quietly poisoning his wife seemed impossible. Some people even organized a small campaign insisting he was innocent. But inside the courtroom, the evidence told a very different story. The toxicology reports explained the timeline of poisoning. The missing arsenic container connected Douglas to the source. The microscopic residue in the kitchen linked the poison directly to Claire's daily routine. And Patricia Holden's testimony revealed the motive. Douglas had wanted a new life. But he didn't want the financial consequences of divorce. He didn't want the damage to his reputation. He wanted Claire gone. Quietly. Without suspicion. When the jury heard the final email he sent to Patricia, the courtroom fell silent. "I think we're nearly there," the message said. For investigators, the meaning had become painfully clear. After deliberating for several hours, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. Douglas Alderton was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Millfield eventually moved forward. The high school replaced its chemistry storage system and removed the remaining hazardous materials. Claire's former students placed a memorial bench in the school courtyard in her honor. The creative writing club she once led was restarted by a new teacher. But the story left behind a lasting lesson. Because the most disturbing part of the case was not just the crime itself. It was how ordinary the person responsible had appeared. Douglas Alderton wasn't a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was the man people trusted. The man who shook hands at football games. The man who stood on stage every year handing out diplomas. And for years, while everyone believed they knew him, he had been carrying out a slow and calculated murder inside his own home. If Dr. Renata Voss had ignored those small details during the autopsy, Claire's death might still be listed as heart disease today. The truth might never have been discovered. Stories like this remind us that sometimes the most dangerous people are not the ones who look suspicious. They are the ones who look perfectly normal. And the only reason we ever learn the truth is because someone asks one more question. If you found this story interesting and want to hear more real cases like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. It really helps the channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you more fascinating investigations and true crime stories. And if you stayed until the end, let me know in the comments what case you'd like to see covered next. Because sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happened.